Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Thank you for joining me for this very first episode of Falling Through the Trap. I'm eager to get started, but I want to take this time to give you some background information that I think you'll find helpful about this podcast and how it all came about. I have to take you back to about 1988 or 89, when I was roughly 11 or 12, to Los Angeles, where my great-great-aunt Betty lived. And Betty was a character. She was 6 feet tall, fiery red hair, a little glamorous. She collected high-end antiques, fine jewelry, and had a bit of a mysterious, scandalous life, which I don't think she'd mind me saying. Later, I would come to understand that she could maybe be a little bit of a pain to the adults in the family with her flair for drama. But to us kids, whom she absolutely adored, her dramatic side, at least to me, was part of what made her so fabulous and fascinating. Adding to this was the fact that her late husband, Tom, was 30 years older than her. She met him around 1938 when she was 17. And of course, he was married. Tom was also a professional gambler, a bookie, and around the mid-1940s, he owned a club in LA called the Yacht Club Cafe. It was on the 8600 block of South Broadway at the time, and Betty was a bookkeeper for card clubs, which is likely how they met. Family lore, or just gossip, was that he also had ties to the mob and was associated somehow with Bugsy Siegel, a well-known mobster. The understanding, however, is that Tom always kept himself on the good side of the law, which records do seem to support. After Tom's wife passed away in the mid-1960s, Tom and Betty were finally married. Then Tom passed away in 1978, a year after I was born, so I never knew him, but Betty talked of him all the time. So many fascinating stories about his life, which brings us back to the late 80s and why we're here today. During this family visit to LA from Colorado, where I live, Betty brought out a thin box. She always had some interesting thing to show off. She collected Chinese antiques, jewelry. So when Betty brought out a box of something to show, you paid attention. This, however, was very unexpected, even by Betty's standards. Inside were early 20th century mugshots, the final portraits of Folsom Prison's condemned men. Just a bunch of loose photos in a box. Some men are well dressed in bow ties and collared shirts and jackets, their hair immaculately combed. One wears a bowler hat. Others were more shabbily dressed and appeared disheveled, a little haunted. Their faces, imprinted on black and white film, revealed to me a variety of emotions: sadness, defiance, shock, indifference. Folsom Prison, which is located about 20 miles northeast of Sacramento, executed just 93 men, and they were all hanged. This occurred between 1895 and 1937. On the back of each photo was typed information, including the man's name, age, the date he was received at the prison, typically right after sentencing, and of course his execution date. Each, except one, had crime, murder first, typed under his name. One was hanged for assaults, and it's quite possibly my favorite of the stories, which, of course, you will hear about in a later episode. And a few of the photographs came with a piece of paper, from a small index card size to a full page, neatly folded and attached with a rusty paperclip, offering additional typed information regarding the inmate. But folded in half and tucked underneath the photos was a 40-page typed text, author unknown, chronicling the history of this now 144-year-old California penitentiary from its legislative beginnings in 1858 up until 1943. How in the world did Betty get these? They certainly didn't come from an antique shop. Apparently, upon a visit to the prison in the 1940s, Tom acquired them. There are a couple of stories of how he might have ended up with these. One was that he used to bring donuts to friends at Folsom. Not sure if that meant staff or residents, probably both, and he got to know Robert Hines, Folsom's warden at the time. Another version was that since Tom was a bookie, he went to Folsom to collect from someone. Again, inmate or staff, we're not really sure. According to Betty, Tom didn't know what to do with this prison ephemera, so he just put them in a suitcase in a closet and basically forgot about them. Betty rediscovered these quite morbid antiquities after Tom's death, and 10 or 11 years later, showed them to me. I was hooked. I thought it was the coolest find ever. It spoke to my love of history, puzzles, and a good mystery. And each picture presented its own mystery. We absolutely judged them by their appearances, made up stories about them. Who were they? How did they get there? Some definitely creeped me out, but I was also saddened by others. Their stares made me uncomfortable, and that's what I remember most. I had these conflicting feelings of sympathy and revulsion. There was a nagging sense of injustice or tragedy surrounding their deaths. I was too young and too sheltered to really comprehend the impacts associated with the prison system and the death penalty, but I did have difficulty dismissing these men as nothing more than cold-blooded killers, which of course ran contrary to the current era I was in, the tough-on-crime stance in the 80s and 90s, that instilled a constant fear of crime with certainly no room for empathy, sympathy, or just nuance. I saw them again a year or two later, but otherwise these were just packed away and that was that, at least for the next 19 years or so. In 2008, I stumbled across a copy of the 40-page text among my late father's writings, and I remembered that he had had an interest in possibly researching and writing about this find, but he never got to it. The document is intriguing in its own right. Among many details, it talks about the number of inmates over the years, construction projects, reports on their farming operations, the prison grew vegetables, raised animals, and any surplus was sent to San Quentin. From what I understand, Folsom was fairly self-sustaining until the 1960s. The text also includes a wonderful narration of a very brazen escape attempt in 1936 by George Hall, the prison's 87th execution. But it was the photographs I really wanted to see. However, Betty had passed away a few years earlier, and it was anyone's guess where the mugshots ended up. Fortunately, my grandfather, Betty's nephew, held on to them after nearly throwing them out. So a few days later, the photographs, along with the original text on this delicate onion skin-like paper, arrived in the mail. This reunion of sorts opened the floodgates of memories as I looked at the same shocked, somber, and apathetic faces I viewed 20 years earlier. Some I remembered because they were just very creepy. Others were just very sad. And for many, their eyes were the clearest part of the picture, and it made me feel a little uneasy. Back in 2008, I had more resources available to piece together these stories, and because I was in between writing projects, the timing couldn't have been better. Online research proved extremely useful in way of newspaper articles and various court documents, and trips to the California State Archives and to the prison itself unlocked really valuable information. The late Jim Brown, a retired Folsom Prison guard who ran the Folsom Prison Museum at the time, had suggested the photographs might have been an unofficial copy given to Tom by Warden Hines, something that Betty also had thought possible. The text, according to Brown, had likely been transcribed by a prison clerk, an inmate entrusted with clerical duties, which could explain the absence of the author's name. After 5 years of research and writing, Folsom's 93, The Lives and Crimes of Folsom Prison's Executed Men, was published in 2013 by a small press in Fresno, California. The book consisted of 93 individual stories of varying lengths, each opening with the condemned man's mugshot and a quote, usually his last words as he stood on the gallows. Really, I began this project 17 years ago now as a person who wanted to tell an interesting story about the history of Folsom Prison, and ended up as someone who became really so engrossed with what I learned that it changed my beliefs and my career direction. When I started researching and writing the book, I still hadn't reconciled these conflicting feelings of revulsion and sympathy. I kept a neutral stance on the death penalty, a polarizing topic, but little did I know that this project would send me on a crash course through the various sciences that have tried well over a century to explain the causes and impacts of crime. But at the time, it was far too much information for me, a college dropout, a writer of humorous personal essays and women's fiction, to navigate those deep, complex waters. Who was I to introduce these themes, let alone share an opinion? I instead focused on my love of history, and these stories were stranger than fiction. I could avoid showing my innate aversion to harsh punishment and arguing why I had any business discussing failures within the criminal justice system, because the stories themselves and the rising cultural popularity of true crime narratives saved me from having to embark on the less accepted, more deeply prevalent themes. My goal, and the one accepted by the publisher, was to tell each story one by one, but in a more journalistic tone. It presented a neat and tidy linear organization that felt like the right and only way to present these stories. I felt the reader would pick up on these various injustices on their own. After publication in 2013, despite a broader understanding of the death penalty and its impacts, I didn't allow a ton of headspace to comprehending this complex topic, and yet one of the most frequently asked questions I got was, well, how do you feel about the death penalty? So I was truthful. I just kept it simple. I didn't have an opinion when I first began, but I now felt it was wrong. My response, however, was kept safely in the realm of wrongful convictions, the execution of the innocent, because who can argue that it's not a tragic injustice to execute an innocent person? And that fit well with the other question I was asked quite often. Were any of the men innocent? And yes, I believe so. Several. Meanwhile, I silently acknowledged there were other reasons to oppose the death penalty, such as the financial impact on public health and the lack of a deterrent effect. But when it came to issues of morality and humanity, those inevitably instigated accusations of being naive and gullible. So I avoided exploring those other reasons beyond their surface. Oh, and the third question was anything to do with Johnny Cash. which I will get to. In the years that followed, I've studied the death penalty further and kept an eye on stories of those on death row fighting to stave off their executions amid claims and evidence of their innocence. The increased public awareness of wrongful convictions through various media channels provided more glimpses into these individualized and nuanced lives of those in prison and on death row. Jump to 2020. Do you all remember 2020? Spring, summer? Yeah, there was a bit going on. We were living in Brooklyn, New York, and like a lot of you, had some extra time on our hands. Lots of time to watch TV, catch up on reading, learn to cut hair. And among that TV time, I watched the Netflix docuseries The Innocence Files, produced by the Innocence Project, an organization I had followed and supported since before publication of the book in 2013. And I thought, well, when this little pandemic blows over, I'll see about volunteering for them. Their headquarters were just across the river from me. Well, we all know how that turned out. And then the murder of George Floyd and the social upheaval that followed. So society was saying enough, and I did too. I supported criminal justice reform, but I lacked the required and vital knowledge of the system itself to really understand what and how to support these efforts. So I made the decision to go back to school for my bachelor's in criminal justice. Even if I didn't know yet what I wanted to do with that degree, my desire to learn about the system and where I could be of use propelled me to take that leap. And if I wasn't busy enough, I decided to rewrite the Folsom book. I wanted to update it, correct some errors, and basically reimagine it. I knew I wanted to explore and convey the deeper truths held within these stories. I acquired my rights to the book, which meant it would be out of print, but I ended up signing with another small press in 2020. But because of school, I didn't begin the rewrite until 2 years later after graduation. But instead of rewriting, I was re-researching, and this renewed deep dive turned into now 3 more years of research material, which made it very overwhelming to even think about how to structure it into a book. And unfortunately, the press I had signed with ended up closing their doors in 2024, and so I began work on a book proposal to find a new publisher, but quickly realized I had the same problem. There was no way I could contain everything in a book, certainly not one that would make both me and the publisher happy. I wasn't willing to compromise, nor did I want to self-publish a 1,000-page book. So this podcast was born. Falling Through the Trap isn't just true crime, but also an exploration into the history of our criminal justice system, how it interacts with society and culture, and what that reveals about humanity, both past and present. While these 93 deaths occurred 88 to 130 years ago, each of their stories remain relevant and speak for the thousands who have stood on the gallows, faced a firing squad, sat in an electric chair or gas chamber, or lain strapped to a gurney. Many of these cases have staked their place in legal history, informing laws, setting precedents, both good and bad, but remembered or recognized for their human element, for their nuances? Certainly not. And arguably, many of these cases would be tried completely different today. It's not lost on me that these men committed horrendous crimes. They took the lives of others and had to be held accountable. But capital punishment, long considered an ineffective deterrent, strips an individual of their humanity and the nuances of their crime, if they are in fact guilty. As I said, based on my years of research, I believe several of these men were not guilty. The turn of the 20th century legal system, law enforcement, the courts, and corrections were all run largely by affluent white males, armed with dehumanizing rhetoric, xenophobia, and class and racial biases. They made the decisions, as did the politicians of the day. But is today's society really that far removed from some of these detrimental beliefs and ideas? If we want to ask ourselves how we got here, how America became a global leader in executions, the stories of these men offer some answers by demonstrating this country's lust for retributive justice. They offer a fascinating and humbling look at how a human, guilty or innocent, can be wrenched from this world with or without consideration, thought, or even the constitutional right to due process. Story humanizes fear and generalizations. What is humanity without storytelling? Humans learn and grow through story. It shapes us, not just as individuals, but as a society, as a species. And my aim is to humanize through story. So, about Johnny Cash, like I said, I was asked about him and his song, Folsom Prison Blues, all the time. It got a little old, but I understood it's hard not to think about Johnny Cash when you hear Folsom Prison. So I will just say this little tidbit, which for all I know is common knowledge, but when I was first researching the book and I had a blog, I was contacted by a couple of people whose fathers were former prison guards and were there in 1968 when Johnny Cash performed at the prison. And Cash wanted to come back a few months later. So his people contacted the prison people, and the prison people said, absolutely not. According to the son of one of the guards, his father had developed a, quote, distaste for Johnny Cash because he had caused and encouraged rioting when he was there. And the prison was not eager to repeat that, so he never went back. Oh, and the second and last thing I will mention about him is that when I toured the prison in 2011, I did walk right by where Cash performed his infamous concert. So for you Johnny Cash fans, I'm not hating on him. The man's a legend. But I just wanted to reiterate that Folsom Prison is so much more than a song. So thank you for sticking with me on this. I'm just going to wrap up this introduction by walking you through a typical execution at Folsom. The death house at Folsom, or what they called the back alley, where executions were performed, also contained the condemned cells, 2 tiers of solid gray granite enclosures sealed with an iron door, and these lined one wall of this sort of triangular-shaped room. At the end of the room, 13 steps led up to the gallows. Some historians say each step represented the convicting jury and judge, and in keeping with this, the rope evidently wrapped above the loop of the noose 13 times. And the length of the rope had to be customized, a task involving physics and math that took into account the man's height and weight. Getting it just right was important so that the man's neck snapped and not the rope. Upon the platform of the scaffold that would be taken down following each execution rested a wooden trap door with 2 black shoe prints painted on top, a kind of X marks the spot where the man needed to stand. Executions were generally performed on Fridays, but it wasn't a set-in-stone rule, so there were just a few deviations over the years. One man in particular would have preferred to deviate from tradition, given that his 34th birthday landed on that same Friday of his execution. But it wasn't up to him. And I got the sense there was some satisfaction on the part of the governor and perhaps the warden that this was how a murderer spent his birthday. It certainly was fodder for the newspapers. 2 days before an execution, the captain of the guard would select 2 guards to act as death watch to make sure the condemned man didn't rob the state the honors of executing him by killing himself first. Because women were not allowed in the execution chamber, The somber crowd that stood below to watch were all men. At the time, law required at least 14 witnesses to an execution. And in the early days, the spectators, as they were often referred to, carried a neat white card with a black outline, an invitation from the warden to attend. Often these were law enforcement, attorney, reporters, and male family members of the victim, although one man was denied access to the execution chamber where his child's murderer hanged because the warden decided for him that it would simply be too emotional for the father, thus causing a scene. A very quiet hush would settle over the room, and you could hear a pin drop. In fact, many witnesses said the only thing you could hear was the ticking of pocket watches. James A. Johnston, a one-time warden at Folsom, and it was also warden at San Quentin and Alcatraz, saw 47 men die on the gallows, which he said he only attended because law required him to. He wrote in 1937, "Every execution upset me. I could not get used to them. I could not get hardened to the idea of seeing a man swing to everlasting destiny on the end of a rope, not even when it seemed the logical ending to a lawless life or the proper penalty for a monstrous murder of extreme abhorrence." Usually, the condemned man spent his final hours writing letters, listening to records played on a phonograph that the warden provided, and having his final dinner, of virtually whatever he wanted. And Johnston talked about this. He said, "From the way he eats, they know how he's going to take it, whether he will hope on or give up. Most of them give up hope." Now, there were some very interesting requests for last meals, and you'll hear about them in upcoming episodes. For some, it was a glass of whiskey or even a glass of milk, a cigar. One asked for a head of lettuce. And not all last requests involved food. For a few, it was to have someone to write his mother because he couldn't bring himself to do it. Others asked the public to please do away with the death penalty. One asked that the noose that would shortly kill him be cut into 13 pieces, each portion sent to the judge and convicting jury. Others simply wanted to reunite with their long-lost brother. But often they simply wanted to hug their wife and children one last time. Some of these earnest requests were honored and some were not. The customary death suit was all black except for a white collarless shirt, which of course left room for the noose. Some men had to be forcibly dressed that morning because he would refuse to do it himself. The men were usually given time to speak to newspaper reporters who gathered around his cell, eager to scribble down his last words, preferably something dramatic for the headlines that would sell lots of copies. In a few minutes before 10 a.m., the warden and 2 guards would arrive at the death cell. A guard would slip a leather belt around the prisoner's waist that would then strap his arms to his sides, and they would begin their grim march. The plain pine box that prisoners constructed for the occasion would be brought in after the condemned man fell through the trap, ready to receive the body. A cruel warden, of which there were many, might have positioned the crude box in plain sight of the man above as he walked from his cell on the top tier to the trap door. But if the man looked up instead, he would have seen a small, mesh-covered window at the top of the vaulted ceiling, said to allow the spirit of the dead man to escape to the afterlife. This kind of gesture was likely not a final act of grace for the condemned, but more out of superstition, to ensure his trapped, cold-blooded spirit didn't haunt the halls of the prison. It wasn't uncommon for the man to have a last cigarette perched between his lips during the walk, and the prison chaplain led the way saying a prayer. Once the man was on the trap, an officer placed the black cap over his head, and then another guard would loop the noose over his head and around his neck. A third guard strapped the man's ankles together while another pulled the rope tight behind the prisoner's ear, and the guards worked quickly. The warden stood where only guards could see him, and on his signal, usually a quiet gesture such as pulling a handkerchief from his breast pocket, a guard would raise his right hand and 3 others would cut the cords, releasing the trap and sending the inmate to his death with a violent wrench. Someone usually fainted, and marked by an obviously broken neck, the man's head hung limply toward the right. The prison physician would climb a little stepladder and steady the still twitching body and monitor the heartbeat, which took anywhere between 6 and 15 minutes to completely stop. Then he would make an official declaration that the man was dead. Prisoners would bring in the coffin and place it under the suspended body. One man would cut it down while others lowered him into the box to be taken to the prison morgue. If a friend or relative didn't claim the body, the man was buried in the prison cemetery, identified only by his prison number chiseled upon a small stone square. Not all of the men executed at Folsom are buried there. Many were claimed by family members. In fact, one is buried in San Francisco's National Cemetery. The gallows would be taken down and erected again a few days before the next execution. And this was not a quiet process. Lots of hammering and construction noise. Those on condemned row had to listen to it all. They also usually knew who would be next, and if they didn't, they just had to find out who was in the cell on the far end. Because after each execution, the men housed in the back alley would move down 1 cell until finally it was his turn, because there were no more cells to move into. So that concludes this introduction. Thank you for coming along with me. I hope you'll continue to tune in as I tell these stories. I really would not have made them my life's work for the last 17 years if I didn't feel they were worth hearing. And I'll note that some stories will be combined, which will make sense when you hear them. I'll also be throwing in an episode here and there discussing some other fascinating people involved in these cases, as well as some topics relating to criminal justice. I'll share photos and other documents on the show page so you can put faces to names and get a broader view of each story, but also on my YouTube channel. Check the show notes for links. And so, without further ado, the next episode, Folsom's first execution, is ready for you to have a listen. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also leave a review, and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on my Substack page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll be able to listen to each episode. Find the show on YouTube as well. Check the show notes for links. Join me every first and third Friday of the month, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.